Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to completely change how you look at Ernest Hemingway's masterpiece, For Whom the Bell Tolls. We're looking way beneath the surface of the text to uncover an absolutely profound story of survival and resilience. We're stepping away from those usual surface-level romantic interpretations to really see one of literature's most famous female characters in a whole new light. Okay, let's dive into this. Is one of literature's most famous romantic leads actually a misunderstood guerrilla-sighter? Think about it. When most people think of Maria in this novel, they picture this starry-eyed, totally submissive romantic lead, right? The classic dream girl, whose whole existence just revolves around the male protagonist, Robert Jordan. But the source text we're analyzing today asks us to completely flip that assumption. What if this young woman isn't a passive romantic object at all? What if she's actually a deeply complex, incredibly resilient guerrilla fighter trying to navigate the gritty, horrifying reality of war? Well, to really grasp that, we first need to understand the world she's fighting in. 500,000. Just let that sink in for a second. That staggering number represents the estimated lives lost during the Spanish Civil War. As the sources point out, this was really the first modern media war. It was the first highly photogenic conflict where photojournalists were actually on the ground, capturing the absolute devastation of civilian populations during air raids and literally transmitting those images around the globe. The human cost was just immense, and the stakes? Absolutely horrific. This wasn't some clean, simple war. It was an era-defining tragedy that completely shattered the lives of everyday folks in Spain. So, to put things into perspective, this tragedy split Spain into this impossible moral nightmare. On one hand, you had the Republicans, or Loyalists, who were backed by the Soviet Union and Mexico. On the opposing side, you had the Nationalists, led by General Franco and supported by fascist regimes like Nazi Germany and Italy. And for everyday people just caught in the crossfire, there really were no clear good or bad choices. Siding with the government meant aligning with Stalin, but backing the rebels meant aligning with Hitler and Mussolini. It was an incredibly politically charged, completely morally ambiguous landscape, where just surviving meant making impossible compromises. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the myth of Maria totally crumbles against this horrific backdrop. For decades, we've been sold this image of a passive, domestic dream girl who just exists to fall in love. But the reality? It's so much darker. She is a severely traumatized survivor of a brutal war crime. She literally watched her parents get executed right in front of her, and then suffered horrific torture and assault by the opposing soldiers. When we meet her in the novel, she isn't just some girl hiding in a cave. She's a refugee. She's a non-combatant participant in a brutal war, desperately trying to piece her shattered self back together. Yet, despite all of this horrific trauma, prominent literary critics have historically just dismissed her. Back in 1941, this major critic, Edmund Wilson, famously called her an amoeba-like little Spanish girl who lives only to serve her lord. Ouch, right? Our source text points out that by fundamentally misunderstanding and minimizing Maria's trauma like this, scholars have actually inflicted what trauma theorists call a second injury. Essentially, the critical reception has spent decades blaming the victim, waving away her desperate coping mechanisms as just simple female submissiveness. To figure out how the critics got it so totally wrong, we have to look at Hemingway's own famous literary philosophy, the iceberg theory. Hemingway famously said there is 7/8 of it underwater for every part that shows. He completely believed in leaving out explicit details so the reader has to really feel the depth of the story beneath the surface. And critics? Well, they've historically only looked at that top 1/8 of Maria, her soft voice, her domestic actions. But to truly understand her depth, we absolutely have to look below the surface. So let's explore that 7/8 underwater, shall we? When we dig into the subtle details Hemingway buried in the text, we uncover Maria's hidden rebellion. She actually rejects traditional skirts and wears trousers, minimizing sex differences to claim an equal status in the militia. Her very first words to the protagonist, Robert Jordan, are, "Hola, comrade," directly identifying herself as a fellow soldier. And maybe most shockingly, she carries a hidden razor blade because she was taught exactly how to slice her own carotid artery to avoid capture. Guys, these are not the actions of a passive victim. This is an active insurgent asserting absolute autonomy over her own life and death. Because of everything she's been through, Maria is fighting so hard to heal. And a crucial part of trauma recovery is narrativizing the event, giving the pain a voice. In the text, Maria actively tries to explain her physical and emotional scars to Robert Jordan. She tentatively tries to share her pain, saying, "I think it was from when things were done to me that it comes." She is desperately trying to connect her past trauma to her current struggles with intimacy and fear. She is practically begging to be heard. And this brilliantly illustrates a heartbreaking dynamic. Listen to Robert Jordan's devastating response. "Let us not talk of that. Truly, that is nothing." Time and time again in the novel, Jordan just shuts her down. He repeatedly silences her trauma narrative because, frankly, he prefers his own romantic ideals over the messy, painful reality of her actual experiences. He wants a perfect fantasy. And by refusing to listen to her, he inadvertently forces her right back into a submissive, silenced feminine domestic role. What the source text makes incredibly clear is that Maria is exhibiting classic, textbook symptoms of acute post-traumatic stress disorder. When we actually view her through the lens of trauma theory, her behavior completely stops looking submissive and starts making tragic, total sense. Her sudden disconnects, her hypervigilance, her trembling, like a wet dog as it's described, and a really intense struggle to reestablish physical intimacy, those are all manifestations of a completely shattered trust in humanity. She isn't just acting submissive, she is trying her hardest to regulate her emotions in a world that has completely destroyed her sense of safety. The violence she endured wasn't random either. It was highly calculated political silencing. The deliberate cropping of her hair, that was a highly visible mark of trauma and public shaming. The iodine branding of UHP on her forehead, which is a proletarian union slogan, marked her strictly as a political enemy. They even taunted her as a bride of the Red Christ, totally twisting religion into a weapon. The reality is she wasn't attacked just randomly as a woman. She was targeted specifically because she was the daughter of the Republican mayor. Yet even in the face of this absolute terror, Maria possessed just incredible inner strength. As she watched her parents die, she tells us she wanted to shout, "Viva la República y viven mis padres." Long live the Republic and long live my parents. Even though she was targeted simply for her proximity to male politicians, this unspoken battle cry proves she held a really profound, independent political loyalty. She actually placed her government first and her parents second. That shows a highly sophisticated understanding of the cause she was suffering for. Let's move to and see how this builds into the climax of our explainer. All of this hidden trauma and quiet defiance really forces us to ask the most important question of the entire novel. When you step back and look at the devastating toll of this war on all the characters in the book, you really have to ask yourself, who is the real survivor here? Who actually endures this sheer brutality without completely losing their humanity? The answer is Maria. She truly is the undefeated spirit of Spain. I mean, think about it. By the end of the novel, the guerrilla leader Pablo is completely broken and cowardly. Pilar has become barbarous from the violence. Robert Jordan and others die. But Maria, she physically survives. Despite being beaten, traumatized, and repeatedly silenced by the people who are supposed to care for her, she lives. She stands as Hemingway's ultimate, powerful metaphor for the indestructible resilience of the Spanish people themselves. Which leaves us with a vital, provocative question. How must we rethink our interpretation of female trauma in classic literature? Because if we just accept those surface-level romantic tropes, we miss the entire iceberg. We completely miss the hidden strength, the profound psychological complexity, and the incredible resilience of marginalized voices. So the next time you encounter a seemingly submissive character in a classic text, ask yourself, what is the 7/8 of the story hiding just beneath the surface? Thanks so much for exploring this with me today, and keep looking deeper.